Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Erudition Network, interactive Black History and Knowledge session that we do every Thursday. Hey, we are in Black History Month, and okay, um, maybe too excited. I am excited. You know, we have this is going to be a good month, right? A really good month to get into history and to talk about Black history as a actual thing that we need. Let me get my box out of here. That we need to know. If you are new to this program or you are coming to this program uh, for the second or third time, I'm going to remind you that this is the Erudition Network. Our purpose, one of the major purposes that we have, is to teach Black history to everyone and to provide knowledge and understanding. That is a part of our logo that sits, that we use. It is something that I hope we hold very dear here on this channel. We do this session every Thursday. We try to make it interactive so that people can ask questions and delve into some things, into some history that they may not have learned in school, or they don't have a really good concept of, or something that may have, sometimes we go into a lot of history that has been hidden and a lot of people just were not exposed to or don't know. As always, we welcome your questions, your inputs. We welcome you to interact and challenge the program, because only by doing that can we learn together, which is another thing that I tell people a lot, which is very important for this month in particular. As we're going through Black History Month, I want us to really think about the fact that we want to learn together as a community, as people, as a nation. We want to not hide our history. Too often, what we are seeing is that people are trying to fight history. They're trying to fight history. They're trying to find some way to circumvent knowledge. And we see that. I've talked about it throughout the past weeks in government now. We see that in schools. And now we're starting to see problems with it, even on social media, where people are making up history. They're saying things that aren't necessarily true because to them, right, they feel that as long as they say something, right, and they look knowledgeable, it's chasing clout. And it's unfortunate, because what happens as a result of all of this is that we have a lot of confusion out here, and people saying and doing things that aren't actual, or putting things out that aren't actually factual. And what we try to do on this program, one of the major things that I always push for on this program, is that we are as truthful with you as possible and as factual with you as possible. We give you where to go. We tell you what to look up, and we validate what it is that we're sharing with you. And we do that because we don't want confusion. We don't want to foster an environment where people don't know what the truth is, can't tell the truth from a lie or a fallacy. And so this is what we do. All right. I tried to give a little bit of time to see if we had any other people coming in on the live broadcast. As always, if you are not able to join us live, if you're not able to participate in the program live, please feel free to still chime in, leave your thoughts, questions, and opines and inputs either on YouTube, on Facebook, where we stream, and we will definitely get back to you with any questions, concerns, or opinions that you have. All right. So tonight, I want to go into some things tonight. And hopefully we'll get people that'll come in here a little bit later. But I'm not going to hesitate any longer. I want to get into this lesson because to me, I've been excited all day, because I believe to my heart that we have to do better in teaching history. And one of the ways to do that is to justify why we teach Black history. Why do we teach it? A lot of times people don't know, or they don't really consider the fact why we have a Black History Month, why we have to spend time emphasizing Black history. And I'll tell you, I teach Black history every week on this program. I provide information every week to the Erudition Network, to our web pages, and onto our TikToks, and and all of the different ways we reach out to people. And we do this because we want people to be able to connect with their history. But the question that often comes up is why? Why do we have to dedicate? Every year we get this. Every year we get this. People say, why do we have to teach Black history? Why do we give a month to teaching something that should be known? Well, it's not known. That's one of the major problems. It's not known. A lot of our history has been covered up, hidden, not shared purposefully. And so every year when that question arises or someone makes that comment, I often just say it is because of that we do this program. We need to think about who we are. So as we go through this lesson, I want you to consider some of the things that I'm saying tonight, and I want you to think about the fact of why we need Black history. But I'm going to give you several different points of knowledge here to validate to you why we need it. And I hope that it will give you some kind of ammunition when you are met with this question, as I'm sure you will be throughout this month. First off, we have to consider the African American. I want to consider the African American tonight. A lot of times I immediately go to Africa, and everything kind of starts with Africa, but I want to talk about the African American tonight. And I want to talk about what is important, what the African American provided to this country, to the world, that makes it important that we focus our time and our efforts on Black history. There are many things that as we look through history, that we see in America that were provided. Even before America was a nation, Africans, Blacks who were brought here, and some who came willingly, helped to push forward the advancement of this continent, of this nation, of the nation in Canada, of South America. And we, as far as exploration, as far as labor, obviously, and as far as even with the military, with soldiering, and how we played into the very aspects and thoughts of what we consider to be democracy and the defense of democracy. The African American, the Black American is significant. And yet we note that in history books, throughout the history books that we are presented in our schools, in our home, or as we grow up, we see that there is a failure to teach that history truthfully and factually. And thus, too many of us don't know the contributions because they're not lauded upon in our books. They're not presented to us in ways that they should. And so we're going to get into that tonight. If you follow this program, you will note that a couple of weeks ago, actually about 2 months ago, I talked about, as we were going into the whole African in history, and we're talking about Columbus, and how important that whole situation was for Columbus when he came over here, because Columbus came over here with a plan. Columbus came over here with a mandate. He came over here to look for gold. He excused the idea and pretended that it was about finding new land, but in fact, they knew that gold was over here. And Columbus inspired many things, right? Columbus inspired many things. See, because the legend of the Blacks, right, that had touched in America had reached Europe through the Portuguese, through the Arabs, right? And we have to note that because they knew, it is important that we don't ignore that. The African, the Black person, inspired them to come over here. The name of guanine, the gold that the indigenous people over here told Columbus about, derives from African language for gold. And the evidence of the Black customs being over here among the indigenous people shows up in their religious worship and the things in the temples that they built. If you go down to South America, it goes along with the statues and idols and the different things that were built. And they built these things in honorarium to the Africans who had come, not as conquerors, but as traders, as brothers, as people who were seeking, that didn't come over seeking war and didn't come to steal from them. When Columbus landed over here, he said that the indigenous people told him that Black folks had been trading. They had been trading gold. He wrote this down in his manuals, but for many people, we speak as if Columbus came over here and he found this country. We've always known that's a lie, but history also tells us, right? It also tells us what he found and why he found it. And here's the thing, there is no question whatsoever. No question. For those of you out here who are history scholars and whatever, go look. Guani is a Mandingo word. It is a Mandingo word. And it is also of note that in 1501, just a few years after Columbus came, there was a law passed forbidding the indigenous people to sell, and it specifically said guanine to the indigenous people. In other words, you could not give them guanine. Now, why would they say that? With the idea that if Africans came or other people came, they could not barter and trade with the indigenous people of Hispaniola. That was a law that was passed. Additionally, if you want to know why the African in history is also important, we hear about this thing called the Columbus Exchange. Our children are taught about the Columbus Exchange. And if you remember it from school, it was this idea that Columbus pushed this idea of trade of products from Europe into the Americas, or at the time it was known as Hispaniola. But here's the problem with all of that. Here's the issue with that, is that a lot of the products that they gave and they attribute to Columbus were in fact not Columbus. These were in fact products that came from Africans who had come over before. I'm going to say that again. It came from Africans who had come over before. The products that were over here, such as tobacco, cotton, sweet potatoes, nuts, peanuts, these were agricultural things that were in Africa that had been shared over here. And in fact, the indigenous people prepared these things in the same way that the Africans did. This is known, but not taught. We look at early slavery and chattel slavery, and two products that became very, very important in chattel slavery post-Columbus were sugarcane and tobacco. We talk about cotton, but in the beginning, in Virginia, there were a lot of tobacco farms. Tobacco was a huge commodity, and tobacco particularly was known in Africa and is mentioned in the early Americas and in England and in Europe as a thing that was spread by Africans. But yet, as we go forward in time, we forget that. They were spread along the same routes that the Africans came through, mingling with the indigenous people in the West Indies. They came up through Florida, and they went all the way up to Canada. We know this to be true because history documents it. We know it to be true because history documents it. In fact, what historian Oviedo said, and I wrote this quote down earlier today. He said that the sweet potato came with the evil lot of Negroes, and it has taken very well and is profitable and of good sustenance for the Negroes, of whom there is a greater number than is necessary on account of their rebellions. We're going to get into that later. All of this, the maize, the sugarcane that is still a part of the African diet, may have, and many historical markers show could have, solely come over from Africa, but we know definitely early on came from Africa. And that African explorers who came over used those things and provided those things to the indigenous people over here as trade. But we are not taught this. We're not taught this. And so when people say, well, why do we teach Black history? Because I guarantee you a majority of people do not know that the yams, the sweet potatoes, the maize, the sugarcane, the tobacco, all of this had African origin and was something that the European wanted also, along with the gold. Because see, if you bring people over to forage for gold, then you must also feed them, clothe them, create colony, thus the name colonizer, so that people can continue to dig up and grow and go out and look for the fortunes that were over here. that the conquistadors and different individuals came over here looking for. The raising of all of this went from Guinea by way of Brazil, well, what we know as Guinea as well as Brazil. And for Brazil, the culture of these crops are still utilized and they're spread, but they have an undoubted, undeniable African origin. And yet, when we do this program or we talk about this history, very often I hear from people who say, I didn't know that. I was never taught that. I was told that Columbus bought this stuff over through the Columbus Exchange. As you're watching this, if you watch the replay of this, go look up the Columbus Exchange if you don't remember it from school and see how many of the things that I just mentioned that they attribute to the European and never mention that the African ever came here before the European, because see, that wasn't the desire. Hey, Sean Anthony, I'm glad that you're here. That wasn't the desire. The desire was to hide. And we have to say that. We have to say that because the evidence shows it. To hide the history of African people, of Black people. Right? For nefarious purposes, for purposes to be able to not give them credit. If you go and you look through your history, you will notice, starting in the 15th century, that the Black people coming to America is mentioned less and less. It is mentioned less and less as them coming over here on their own. We have the 1619 Project. We have all of these different African-American studies programs, but many of them don't talk about history before 1619. Africans were coming over here well before they were slaves. They are people who were here. That's okay. I appreciate you, Tina. They were here. And as we move forward in time, and as we become less biased and prejudiced, we can speak about this. This is why I encourage you, when you watch this program, to share this program. Because I really believe, no, I know, because I also go on social media. I also look at what people put out. My wife was just telling me earlier about social media. I engage with social media because I have to see what is being put out there. I encourage people to send me questions so I know what they're being told and what they're being taught. It is sad, many times I get on TikTok or Facebook or whatever, and I see people on teaching history full of sophistry and fallacy, full of lies, false truths, half-truths, and 1,000 people are watching them, co-signing ignorance because they don't know better, but they're thirsty to have knowledge. And then I get on and I ask these people, whenever I see these broadcasts, telecasts, I ask them, well, where's your source? To which they hardly ever admonish the question. But those who do admonish it say, well, it's out there. That's not giving me a source. But we do that here. We give you a source. we tell you where to go. If you want to read about Columbus's actual voice and look at the things that he actually said, you can go and pull up Ivan van Setema's book. I think I have a copy of it over here somewhere. Ivan van Setema's book, They Came Before Columbus. You could go pick up Laurent Benton Jr.'s book, Before the Mayflower. Or you can simply go online, go over to the libraries in Europe, because you can access those, and search on Columbus's actual transcribed logs. And know that everything that I've told you so far is truth. Not fallacy, not made up, not me just shooting to you some random fact. It's important that we know our history. And it's important that you share broadcasts like this that teach it truthfully. Getting back to what we were talking about, because tonight, again, we're trying to talk about why. This is going to be part one. There's no way to do this within an hour. So it'll be part one. But we want to talk about the significance of the Black people in America, in the Americas. When I tell you that getting into the 15th century, we're mentioned less and less about how they came over before, and we start to get into the slave eras. And so to justify that, you can't have intellectual, smart, sailing people coming over here. You can't perpetuate the fact. You have to illustrate the lie that they're less than, that they're slaves. 1619 is not the first time Blacks came over here. That is a lie. In 1501, Blacks were allowed to enter the colonies. In 1503, the colonies that were down Hispaniola. In 1503, the governor of Hispaniola sought to prohibit the transportation to America because they felt that the Africans who came over here not as slaves were inciting the natives and teaching them to rebel. And so they prohibited them for a better part of 3 years. It wasn't until 1506 that they started to come again. And there's a reason behind this. Because if you remember, what was happening is that the Spanish had come and the indigenous people were dying from disease, from abuse. And the work that they were being forced to do in the Inca media system as slaves, they couldn't physically do without dying. So either they tried to run away, which they would be either caught or they would get away. They were losing labor. So by 1506, the Spanish said, let the Blacks come back over here. This is the step to where we went 100 years later into full on the introduction of chattel slavery. They allowed us to come again because by their own documentation, by the governors, Columbus's son, by the priest over there, they wrote and said that one Negro, one Black, was worth more than 4 Indians in the amount of work that they could do from can't see to can't see. That is a historical fact. And that is well before 1619. By 1518, the biggest thing that was being pushed was sugarcane. The Spanish was pushing it from the Americas and from the Canary Islands. and it was profitable. And they needed blacks because they were strong and because they could endure. They needed them for labor. So by 1521, it became an issue that they had to separate completely the blacks from the indigenous people. Because in 1521, it became an issue where there was rebellion. There was rebellion. People were fighting. And they blamed it on the blacks who were telling the indigenous people, you don't have to endure this. And they would run off together. We know this, that in about 1528, that the Spanish had an issue in Florida where blacks, indigenous people, and some actual Spanish people fought against the companies and the shipbuilders that came there and ran off and started tricultural relations in Florida. It's funny how Florida doesn't teach that, and they don't want that taught in Black history with the laws that DeSantis is putting out. But that is a fact. Blacks were everywhere, and they weren't just slaves. They weren't just slaves. In 1540, we note that there was a priest in Querétaro, Mexico, what we call Mexico now. They were in Guatemala. They were in Mexico. They were everywhere, and they weren't slaves. This is before 1619. But there was a nefarious point that was being done. The Spanish passed something called the Ascenso del Negro, in which what they did was limit the ability of blacks to own land, to educate themselves under the Spanish government. So by the time we get to 1619, this is because for about 100 years, they have slowly reduced the ability of people of color, black people, to excel, to be equal in a society. But we have documentation after documentation after documentation of blacks being over here. I don't know if you know Nefalo Delano. He was a black man. And he was with Balboa when he discovered or first realized, the first one to go into what we call the Pacific Ocean. Black man was there with him. Blacks were everywhere. They were helping to build. As a matter of fact, when Balboa was trying to create transportation, it was Indians who were being supervised by blacks because they trusted blacks, because they had seen or heard or knew about the African coming over here, not as a conqueror. But if we look at the history that we're taught of slavery, if we look at what has been pushed to us in our school systems, we start with 1619. And why is that? We've actually commercialized it. People are wearing hats. They're teaching lessons. And they're ignoring the fact that by 1528, when that uprising happened in Florida, by the estimates of what the people and the ships that had come over here, that we can go back and look at the logs, there were at least 10,000 blacks in the New World who were not slaves. And that is what we need to know about our history. They worked as agents. They worked as assistants. They worked as soldiers. In 1539, the Conquistador de Soto took blacks to the Indians in Alabama. And blacks became the first actual settlers into what we know as the America in the South, in Alabama, and states where they don't want you to learn Black history. In 1555, we know this to be true, that this was a fact in Alabama, because Santiago de Chile, who was a Black man, had a deed of land in the area, was given land and property in the area. In South America, there were Black artisans and agriculturalists and builders who founded St. Augustine. In 1565 and in 1570, Blacks helped to not only build but grow the town of Santiago de Principe. But we don't hear that. We don't hear about the agriculturalists. We don't hear about the people who painted and built and created these towns, because that is not what people want us to know about our history. And all of this is documented, just hidden, not given to us, not shared with us. I'm not giving you some whimsical fantasy here. About a couple of months ago, I asked everybody who was Estevanico. And people didn't know who Estevanico was. He was an explorer. He's one of the first explorers to actually go in and be accepted by the indigenous people. He was welcomed, and he went before the white colonists who were coming in to basically soften the Indians into their acceptance of what was to come. But Estevanico is rarely mentioned in our school books. And when he is, he's only mentioned as a person that was a subordinate to others, which is not true. The idea and the push of the conquistadors was to find wealth. And they knew from Columbus's writing, from what they had been told, Estevanico was successful with the indigenous people because he understood their finger language, how they talk. He would talk with his hands. He knew their language, and he was proficient in their language, not just their vocal language, because a lot of those languages had been passed. But a lot of the history is stripped. A lot of the history is not generally known. Because of the success of people like Estevanico, the Spanish were able to go into the lower part of the United States, to come out of South America and go up through Texas, Alabama, Mississippi, and ingratiate themselves to these tribes. In fact, in 1537, Cortez did not just take Spaniards. He took 400 Spaniards, excuse me, and 300 blacks. And he sailed up the Gulf of California. And yes, and they named it California. And that name is interesting too, because that wasn't just a random name that Cortez pulled out. That wasn't just a random name. When you look at the name of California, and I wish I had people on here tonight, because I would definitely ask you this question. Because I know I have friends in California, but I doubt that they know this, even though I believe that I may have covered this at some point. But there was a man named Garcia del Montalvo. And in 1510, he published a romance novel, a romance story. And what he did is in this story, he talked about California, an island called California in the New World, because Columbus had came and he was inspired to write this story. And it was said in this fictional land of California, it was people with Black women who did not have any men among them. They were Amazonian, because they were accustomed to live in that fashion, in that style. They were strong, they were hardy, they were smart, they were courageous. He wrote this story, and later on, when Cortez took the 400 Spaniards and the 300 Blacks, and he sailed up the Gulf of, he named it California. And that name has stayed. Then once he finished with what he was doing in his seeking, he went back to Spain, and that name was propagated even further. And people could understand that because they remembered Montalvo, his story. You can't tell me that this history is being provided. I have asked over the years many people, and I have gone over and over and over this history with many different individuals. And every time someone tells me, I did not know that. But I'm telling you today that we're here to provide that history to you. And this is why I love Black History Month, because throughout this month, we're going to do something every day to open up your aperture for history, to allow you to have a better run, if you choose to. That's the catch. You have to choose to want to know. You can go look up Estevanico yourself. I'll even type his name. I think I did it before. I'll type Estevanico's name in there for you to remember. But go look him up. Go look up Estevanico. Learn that little piece of how Blacks helped to establish this, what later became America, how they were the first ones by the documentation of the Spanish to walk in these lands as an outsider. Even though there is that's in itself is a fallacy. It's not true. They were here before. I also, as we come around to the last 15 or 20 minutes or so of this program, exploring is a part of the Black legacy over here. I stressed it in this program tonight because I don't want you fixated on 1619 when people arrived here in bondage. That's not true. And it is only perpetuated because people want you to feel inferior. The African, the Black person, since a lot of us don't want to be called, I recently was told, don't like to be called African. I don't have any connection to Africa. You feel you have no connection to Africa because you felt it was stripped from you. Well, stripped means that it was taken by force. But you can always get that connection back. It's just a choice. It's a simple choice. And hopefully through learning this history, you will find yourself wanting to make the choice to learn about your ancestry. Lastly tonight, because I had a couple of things I wanted to cover that went longer than I wanted to. I also want to talk about democracy, freedom, liberty. All the and maybe I won't get all the way through this week. Maybe we'll wind up doing this again next week and we'll go further. But those little catchwords, right, that everybody tends to like to hear: liberty, freedom, democracy. Those things that we say make us Americans. But we forget democracy was not something that was made necessarily or here in America. And I dare tell you that the only reason why it became a need is because of blacks. Yes, I said it. It's because of blacks. Think about it. Without blacks here in the United States, in the Americas, I dare tell you that there would be no victory in the war for independence. There would have been no victory in the Civil War. Without the help of the black soldier, without the care of the black woman, nursing, feeding, knitting, there would be no America. That is the forceful way that blacks contributed to those things such as democracy, freedom, and liberty. But if we were to be honest, black people are the central thread of what we consider to be American history. I'm not saying no one played a part, but let's explore this a little bit, and then we'll get more into it next week. They are the catalyst, the major point of why we can use those words and have the ideals of those words mean something. Without the chattel slavery, blacks being treated the way that they were, without the contributions that they made physically, emotionally, spiritually, as commerce and everything swelled from the 1700s into the 1800s on the backs of blacks. You cannot tell me that black history is not important when these people are your catalyst. They are the thing that makes this democracy possible. And if you don't believe that, think about what democracy used to mean, what it used to mean. Democracy to the European meant simply the transfer of a privilege, of power, of opportunity to someone else, an underling, so that a merchant could make his way to nobility or close to nobility. That's what it meant. But America, due to its change, and how it treated black people, it changed the idea of what democracy is. But yet, We have people saying that they don't understand why we have a Black History Month. The very definition of democracy became something different, became a different mental concept. And that's something that we have to explore. And I know there will be people who say, Eddie, you're reaching on that. Sorry, give me a moment here. I'm hearing music in the background. All right. I don't know where that is, and hopefully it's not so loud that you all are being, but I can hear it. But the issue is that we have to be able to understand how Blacks contributed. And I know we're coming down to the end of this hour. But it's important. It is definitely important that we consider these things. I don't want to get so far into that new subject, but we're going to talk about that next week. How Black folks contributed to what we see as democracy, liberty, freedom. And how the same people who would ascribe and scream those words out, right, are the same people that will tell us that there should not be a Black History Month. We'll get into it next week because I think that that's something we need to talk about. Because see, the right of birth, the fact that you were born by the founders of this country and the Enlightenment thinkers of Europe, provided every human being, and that's the catch, that's the key word there, the divine right. It was called the divine right. God given to wealth, industry, business. You had the right to be alive and to prosper. That is in our Declaration of Independence, because it was inspired by the Enlightenment thinkers. You have the ability to grow yourself. You had the ability, European law, to ask questions of your sovereign. That's what they did in the establishment of America. But we assume, we tell ourselves that the Black man, the Black woman, is passive and unintelligent. We have been told for generations that he provides no worth, no gift to where we are. But I just told you that they were explorers. They were agriculturalists. They were intelligent. They were builders. They were mathematicians. They were sailors. And they came over here before 1619. They were not beasts of burden. They were not laborers. They were not just mindless brutes and soft flesh to manipulate. That's not who they were. It wasn't an accident that they were over here. It wasn't an accident that they were later absconded and stolen to still come over here. Black people had a determination, just like with any other person. But there was something else that had due to slavery that changed the concept again of democracy. It was the desire, the will to be free, to want to be an active member of society, to want to be looked at as an equal. And it changed the idea of what we see as just privilege. See, that's the difference here. And we're going to get into that next week because we hear that word a lot nowadays, privilege. There's a difference. Democracy is not privilege. Black people changed that idea. Ladies and gentlemen, we're coming up on this hour. I really wish we'd had more people in here today, but I'm happy if you go in and you watch this podcast later, watch it all the way through. Try to learn some of your history, provided. If you don't want people to watch it and grow, by all means, you can go on your way. But if you want our culture, our nation to be better, you should be sharing programs like this. I said like this. I do not believe that we're the only ones out here teaching, providing knowledge. But what I am saying is, if you find that people are honest with you at providing you history and knowledge, then I would hope you'd want to grow that. I would hope that you'd want to share that. Thank you to all of those who are faithful viewers and watchers of this program. And I thank you for your continued patronage and sharing of this program with others. But I will tell you, until next week, you will see things that will come out on Erudition. The interactive is on Thursdays, and I will be back next Thursday to do another show. But for right now, let me just say thank you. I hope you get something from this episode and from this lesson, and I hope that you share it with family, friends, loved ones, even your enemies if you want to. So we welcome them all, so that they can come on if they want to argue or because people do that too. But anyway, until next week, until next time, I hope you have a blessed and wonderful rest of the week, and we will see you on the interactive next week. Thank you.